standards would shame an alley cat. For some reason or other, they absolutely refuse to accommodate themselves to any kind of decent, civilized life. This was said in 1956 in Indianapolis, not about blacks or other minorities, but about poor whites from the South.
Interesting.
Nor was Indianapolis unique in this respect. A 1951 survey in Detroit found that
Wow.
white Southerners living there were considered undesirable by 21% of those surveyed, compared to 13% who ranked blacks the same way. In the late 1940s, a Chicago employer said frankly, "I told the guard at the plant gate to tell the hillbillies that there were no openings." When poor whites from the South moved into northern cities to work in war plants during the Second World War, occasionally a white Southerner would find that a flat or a furnished room had just been rented when the landlord heard his Southern accent. More is involved here than a mere parallel between blacks and Southern whites. What is involved is a common subculture that goes back for centuries, which has encompassed everything from ways of talking to attitudes toward education.
Wow, that picture is very revealing. The picture itself is very revealing. You have someone from the north, the southern, the southern, the people from the south, and then the blacks. As a depiction. Wow, it's very interesting. Even though they're from the Caucasian race, and the other ones are from the more no black race, they're still in the same baseline because of the culture.
Education, violence, and sex, and which originated not in the South, but in those parts of the British Isles from which white Southerners came. That culture long ago died out where it originated in Britain, while surviving in the American South.
Wow.
Then it largely died out among both white and black Southerners, while still surviving today in the poorest and worst of the urban black ghettos. It is not uncommon for a culture to survive longer where it is transplanted and to retain characteristics lost in its place of origin. The French spoken in Quebec and the Spanish spoken in Mexico contain words and phrases that have long since become archaic in France and Spain. Regional German dialects persisted among Germans living in the United States after those dialects had begun to die out in Germany itself. A
Interesting.
scholar specializing in the history of the South has likewise noted among white Southerners archaic word forms, while another scholar has pointed out the continued use in that region of terms that were familiar at the time of the first Queen Elizabeth. The card
Wow.
game whist is today played almost exclusively by blacks, especially low-income blacks, though in the 18th century it was played by the British upper classes and has since then evolved into bridge. The history of the evolution of this game is indicative of a much broader pattern of cultural evolution in much more weighty things. Southern whites not only spoke the English language in very different ways from whites in other regions. Their churches, their roads, their homes, their music, their education, their food, and their sex lives were all sharply different from those of other whites. The history of this redneck or cracker culture is more than a curiosity. It has contemporary significance because of its influence on the economic and social evolution of vast numbers of people, millions of blacks and whites, and its continuing influence on the lives.
Wow, so that means that the culture of degeneracy in Britain is still very predominant in the black community. If what Thomas Sowell is saying is that that Southern culture is still prevalent in the United States, right? Even back then was equally established. And of course, there's some differences because there's some classes differences because of the race. I understand that, but the culture itself has been kept on onto the present day. If that's the conclusion, um, can we go somewhere where we can just substitute the culture for the new culture? Now, this new culture has the same demand for the old one.
And deaths of a residual population in America's black ghettos, which has still not completely escaped from that culture.
Hmm.
From early in American history, Foreign visitors and domestic travelers alike were struck by cultural contrasts between the white population of the South and that of the rest of the country in general,
Wow.
and of New England in particular. In the early 19th century, Alexis de Tocqueville contrasted white Southerners with white Northerners in his classic Democracy in America, and Frederick Law Olmsted did the same later in his books about his travels through the antebellum South, notably Cotton Kingdom.
Hmm.
The cultural values and social patterns prevalent among Southern whites included an aversion to work, proneness to violence, neglect of education,
That is
sexual
interesting.
promiscuity, improvidence.
That is so interesting. That is very interesting. They're basically wild. Very wild. Hmm.
Drunkenness, lack
Yep.
of entrepreneurship, reckless searches for excitement, lively music and dance, and a
Some
style of
guns.
religious oratory marked by strident rhetoric, unbridled emotions, and flamboyant imagery. This oratorical style carried over into the political oratory of the region in both the Jim Crow era and the Civil Rights era, and has continued
Hmm.
on into our own times among black politicians, preachers, and activists. Touchy pride, vanity, and boastful self-dramatization were also part of this redneck.
I travel to the South, and I can. People are definitely different. Um, and it's not that one is better than the other. It's just the way they express is very different. People from the South, they have more like a soul to their language, to their English dialect. Um, which it remind me actually when I used to live in New York. I just remind me from people from Brooklyn. Sometimes, people that didn't speak, the Eastern or New England, New York accent. If they didn't have a New York accent, it would resemble you. Uh, For example, I live right now in Wisconsin, and people right here in the ghettos, when they talk to you, they sound kind of the South. And it's true. I think there was I think it's true that people from the South that moved to the North, and they kept the dialect. Of course, from the South, so that probably could be a reason.
Culture among people from regions of Britain where the civilization was the least developed. They boast and lack self-restraint,
Hmm.
Olmsted said, after observing their descendants in the American antebellum South. While Professor Grady McWhiney's Cracker Culture is perhaps the most thorough historical study of the
Wow.
values and behavioral patterns of white Southerners, many other scholarly studies have turned up very similar patterns, even when they differed in some ways as to the causes. Professor David Hackett Fisher's Albion Seed, for example,
Albion seat for British folks way in America. Oh, okay.
challenges the Celtic connection thesis put forth by Professor McWhiney, but shows many of the same cultural patterns among the same people, both in Britain and in the American South. Popular writings of the 19th and 20th centuries have likewise described similar behavior,
Hmm.
including the Indianapolis residents' comments on white Southern migrants to that city, which sound
Hmm.
so much like what many have said about ghetto blacks. None of this is meant to claim that these patterns have remained rigidly unchanged over the centuries, or that there are literally no differences between whites and blacks in any aspects of this subculture. However,
Subculture.
what is remarkable is how pervasive and how close the similarities have been.
People with ADHD say
So basically, what is considered the culture of the black community today is clearly very well connected to the Southern culture from the 18th and 19th century. Hmm. I mean, it could be. I mean, there's a lot of resemblance. I mean, the thing is that one group of people they managed to just drive and detach some of the bad aspects, even though probably common residuals. are kept, but the majority managed to just move on. Compare, let's say, compare from whatever it was in the 19th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, doesn't look not even closely resemble for what is today. That culture in particular, but this older culture has embraced all those bad things and managed to just keep moving to that direction. Because even though there's certain pendulums moving to the more upper class, right, or middle class, there's still a strong culture that is keep moving left, where still the gangster culture, sex and degeneracy is still very prevalent. I don't know. Thomas Sowell, again, he a great guy in these things, and I'm just learning from him. All right, this is it. Thank you so much, guys.